The storm had raged for hours, turning the world outside into a white abyss. Samuel Carter sat by the fire in his secluded cabin, listening to the wind howl like a wounded animal. The snow battered against the windows, relentless, almost angry. Living alone in the Alaskan wilderness for the past 5 years had made him accustomed to the brutality of nature, but tonight, something felt different. Then came the sound. A scratching, desperate, weak. Samuel frowned. He stood, grabbing his lantern, and walked toward the door. He expected the wind to have knocked a branch loose, or maybe a stray animal had wandered too close. But when he pulled open the heavy wooden door, the sight before him sent ice crawling up his spine. 2 wolves, barely standing, their bodies trembling, fur-matted with snow and blood. Their once mighty forms were reduced to shadows of what they should have been. But that wasn't what made Samuel's breath hitch in his throat. It was their eyes. They weren't wild. They weren't hostile. They were pleading. He had lived in the wild long enough to know wolves never begged, never sought help from a human. And yet, here they were, one limping, the other barely standing, eyes locked onto his with a silent, desperate message. Samuel's instincts screamed at him to shut the door. Wolves were unpredictable, dangerous. But another part of him, something deeper, something older, kept him rooted to the spot. The larger wolf, a grizzled male with a streak of silver down his back, took a trembling step forward before collapsing onto the porch with a heavy thud. The second wolf, a smaller female, let out a mournful whimper and nudged him weakly. Samuel exhaled sharply. Damn it, he knew he was making a mistake. Knew it deep in his bones. But his hands were already moving, grabbing a thick woolen blanket from inside. Carefully, he wrapped it around the fallen wolf and lifted him into the cabin. The female followed, staggering in on unsteady paws. The moment he shut the door, the world outside became a deafening scream of wind and ice. Inside, silence. Samuel worked quickly, dragging the heavier wolf near the fire. His coat was thick, but beneath it, Samuel could feel ribs pressing against his fingers, starvation. The female curled up protectively beside the male, her golden eyes locked onto Samuel, watching his every move. What happened to you? He murmured, more to himself than to them. He fetched warm water, dampening a cloth and running it over the bloodied fur. The male wolf barely stirred, his breathing ragged. Samuel pressed his fingers to the wound along the animal's side and felt heat radiating from it, infection. It was bad. The female let out a low whine, her ears flattening as if she understood. Samuel grabbed his medical kit. He wasn't a vet, but he knew enough. Living alone out here, you had to. He cleaned the wound, ignoring the way the female tensed every time he touched her companion. He worked carefully, trying not to think about how bizarre this was. He was tending to wild wolves. And they were letting him. After an hour of tending, the bleeding had stopped. He wrapped the wound in gauze and sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. The fire crackled softly. The cabin was warm, safe, so different from the raging storm outside. The female rested her head on the male's neck, licking his muzzle gently. Samuel watched them, feeling something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Connection. Trust. Then he noticed something strange. Around the female's neck, tangled in her thick fur, was a tattered leather collar. Samuel's blood ran cold. These weren't just wolves. They had belonged to someone. And someone had let them go to die. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. And whatever had happened to these wolves, whatever had driven them to his door, was something far more dangerous than the storm outside. Samuel couldn't take his eyes off the collar. It was old, worn, nearly hidden beneath the female wolf's thick fur. A wild wolf would never wear such a thing. His pulse quickened. Someone had owned her. Someone had let her go. Or worse, someone had wanted her gone. The storm outside howled, rattling the cabin walls, but Samuel barely heard it. His focus was on the wolves. The male remained unconscious, his sides rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The female, though weak, stared at Samuel with an intensity that made his skin prickle. You had an owner, he murmured, reaching for the collar. The moment his fingers brushed the leather, the female let out a low growl, not one of aggression, but of warning. Her golden eyes darkened, and for the first time, Samuel saw something beyond pain and exhaustion. Fear. It's okay, he said gently, hands raised in surrender. I just want to see something. He moved slower this time, careful not to spook her. The leather was cracked from exposure to the elements, the buckle rusted. As he shifted the thick fur away, his breath caught in his throat. There, burned into the leather in deep, uneven letters, was a single word. Project Revenant. Samuel's stomach twisted into a tight knot. He didn't recognize the name, but something about it made his blood run cold. He had spent years in these woods, isolated from the world, But he wasn't naive. He had heard whispers of government experiments in the deep wilderness. Wolves used for tracking, genetic testing, behavioral manipulation. It had always sounded like conspiracy theories. Until now. His gaze flickered to the wolves. What had they been put through? And why had they come to him? The male let out a weak whimper, shifting slightly. The female immediately nuzzled against him, licking his muzzle in a comforting gesture. They had a bond, strong, unbreakable. Samuel could see it in every movement. They weren't just packmates. They were survivors. And something had driven them from whatever hell they had escaped. Samuel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. If these wolves had been part of an experiment, someone would be looking for them. But the way they had arrived, starving, injured, desperate, it didn't seem like an escape. It felt like an abandonment. Like someone had thrown them away. His jaw tightened. He had seen cruelty before. The world wasn't kind to the things it no longer found useful. A sudden sharp knock rattled the door. Samuel's blood turned to ice. No one came this deep into the wilderness. Heart pounding, he rose to his feet, glancing at the wolves. The female had stiffened, ears perked, eyes locked on the door. Whoever was outside, it wasn't a friendly visitor. Slowly, Samuel reached for the rifle mounted above his fireplace. The knock came again, harder, more impatient. Samuel tightened his grip. Whoever was on the other side of that door. They weren't just here for shelter. They were looking for something. Or someone. And Samuel had a sinking feeling he already knew what. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps, deliberate and forceful. Samuel's pulse thundered in his ears. No one came this deep into the wilderness unless they had a damn good reason. And that reason was rarely good for anyone on the other side of the door. He tightened his grip on the rifle, stepping silently toward the entrance. The female wolf, sensing the tension, lowered her body, her ears flat against her skull. The male let out a low, ragged breath, still too weak to move. Samuel took a steadying breath and leaned toward the door. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a voice. "Mr. Carter, open the door." Samuel froze. His name. Whoever was out there knew exactly who he was. He darted a glance at the wolves. The female was trembling, her body pressed protectively against the injured male. She knew this voice. Samuel's gut twisted. "I'm not interested in visitors," he called back, keeping his voice steady. A pause. Then, "We know you have them." Cold sweat prickled at the back of Samuel's neck. He shifted his grip on the rifle, his mind racing. He had no idea what these wolves had been through, but he knew one thing, he wasn't handing them over. Outside, boots crunched against the snow. "Mr. Carter," the voice said again, smoother now, as if trying to ease a skittish animal. "Let's not make this difficult." Samuel clenched his jaw. "Come back when the storm clears," he said, loud enough to be heard over the wind. "I'll see if I feel like company then." A sharp chuckle. "I don't think you understand." Something slammed against the door, rattling the frame. The female wolf let out a sharp growl, her hackles rising. Samuel didn't flinch. His finger curled around the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. The wind howled outside. Then, footsteps, crunching through the snow. Fading. Leaving. Samuel didn't move. Didn't breathe. He kept his gaze locked on the door, listening. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then, from outside, barely above the wind, "He's not going to give them up that easily." Plan B. Samuel's stomach dropped, and then the night was silent again. But he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. He turned to the wolves, his heart still pounding. The female was watching him, eyes wide, body rigid. He crouched down, his voice low, steady. "Who were they?" he murmured, knowing full well he wouldn't get an answer. But the look in the wolf's eyes said enough. They were the ones she had been running from. And now, they knew exactly where she was. Samuel let out a slow breath. He had a choice to make. He could pretend this wasn't his fight. He could open the door, let the wolves fend for themselves, and go back to his quiet, lonely life. Or, he could fight. And if there was one thing Samuel Carter knew how to do, it was how to survive. He exhaled sharply and stood. "If they're coming back," he said, glancing toward the door, "we'd better be ready." The storm outside raged on, but the real danger was just beginning. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as Samuel paced. His mind raced, cataloging everything he had, supplies, weapons, exits. His survival instincts had kept him alive through harsh winters and isolation, but this was different. This wasn't nature. This was them. He glanced at the wolves. The female had settled beside the injured male, her body tense, ears twitching at every sound outside. She wasn't resting, she was waiting. Samuel knelt beside her. "You've been running a long time, haven't you?" The wolf blinked, her golden eyes locking onto his. A moment passed between them, silent understanding hanging thick in the air. She knew danger when she smelled it. And so did Samuel. He moved quickly, dousing the fire in the hearth. The room dimmed, shadows stretching across the wooden walls. Outside, the storm raged on, snow pelting the windows in a relentless assault. If those men were planning something, they wouldn't risk a full-scale attack in this weather. No, they'd wait. But Samuel had no intention of giving them the chance. He grabbed his rifle, checked the ammunition, then turned back to the wolves. "We're not just going to sit here." The female tilted her head, watching him. "Either we run," he muttered, "or we fight." The male wolf let out a weak whimper. He was in no condition to move. Even if he could walk, dragging an injured animal through a blizzard was suicide. Samuel clenched his jaw. Running wasn't an option. His gaze flickered to the windows. The storm gave him an advantage. Visibility was near zero, and sound was swallowed by the howling wind. If he struck first, he might catch them off guard. He exhaled slowly. No more waiting. He pulled on his coat, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and grabbed a hunting knife from the table. The female wolf rose to her feet, ears perked. Samuel looked at her. "You coming?" For a second, she just stood there. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, her head held high despite the exhaustion weighing on her body. A survivor. Samuel couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. He cracked the door open. The wind slammed against him, biting at his skin, but he pushed forward. Snow had already buried the footprints from the men outside, but he knew where they'd be. The tree line. The only place to take cover in an open storm. Samuel crouched low, moving silently across the frozen ground. The female wolf followed, her body a ghostly blur against the snow. Then, voices. He dropped low behind a fallen log, gripping his rifle. The wolf stilled beside him, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Through the trees, two figures stood near the edge of the forest, barely visible through the snowfall. Their backs were to him, their heads close together as they spoke. Samuel strained to hear. "Storm's messing up visibility." A pause. Then, "We can't leave them here. If we don't bring them back, you know what happens." The second voice was sharper, edged with impatience. "We'll come back at first light. Set the traps, make sure they can't run." Samuel's grip on the rifle tightened. They weren't just planning to take the wolves. They were making sure they had no escape. The female wolf let out a low, nearly inaudible growl. Samuel turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. He didn't know if she understood what was happening, but he saw it again, the fear. No, not fear. Memory. She had been trapped before. Samuel's jaw clenched. He knew what he had to do. They were waiting for morning, so he wouldn't wait at all. He took a slow breath, raised his rifle, and fired. A single shot cracked through the night. One of the men dropped. The second man spun, cursing, but before he could react, a blur of white fur lunged from the shadows. The female wolf hit him hard, knocking him off balance. He screamed, but Samuel was already on him, slamming the butt of his rifle into the side of his head. The forest fell silent. The man crumpled into the snow. Samuel stood there, breath heaving, his pulse thudding against his skull. The female wolf backed away, panting. Snow clung to her fur, her body shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Samuel wiped a hand across his face, staring down at the unconscious man. They weren't dead, but they wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. Samuel exhaled sharply and turned back toward the cabin. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But he had made his choice. He wasn't going to let the wolves be taken, no matter what it cost him. Samuel stood over the fallen men, his breath curling in the frigid air. The storm howled around him, swallowing the silence left in the wake of violence. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper. He had thought himself done with killing. The war had taken enough from him, but some things weren't up for negotiation. The female wolf panted beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the unconscious man sprawled in the snow. Samuel could still feel the impact of his rifle stock against the man's skull, the way the bone had given way beneath the force. This wasn't over. He knew better than to assume these two were alone. Samuel turned his gaze back to the tree line, scanning for movement. The snowfall was thick, swirling like ghostly figures in the darkness. If there were more of them, they'd either heard the shot or been close enough to see what had happened. They'd come. Sooner or later. Samuel took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. His first instinct was to drag the men inside, but that was a mistake. If their friends came looking, all they had to do was follow the blood trail leading straight to his doorstep. He crouched, grabbing the nearest man by the collar and yanking him upright. The man groaned, barely conscious, his head lolling to the side. Samuel grit his teeth and started dragging him deeper into the woods. The female wolf followed, her ears pinned back. She stayed close, her breath ragged but steady. Samuel knew she understood the danger just as much as he did. 15 yards. That was all he needed. Far enough to keep suspicion away from the cabin. Far enough that, if the others came, they'd find these two before they found him. Samuel dropped the first man unceremoniously onto the snow and turned back for the second. The female wolf didn't move, standing guard over the unconscious figure like she was waiting for him to wake up. Samuel gave her a wary glance before dragging the second man to the same spot. He checked their pockets, knives, a radio, and a revolver with only 3 bullets left. Not enough to matter. Samuel took the radio, then smashed it against a rock. No calling for help. Not tonight. He stepped back, surveying his work. They weren't dead. He had made sure of that. But when they woke, they'd be in no condition to do anything but crawl back to wherever they had come from. If they were smart, they'd take that as a warning. But Samuel had met men like them before. They never ran from a fight. He turned to the female wolf, who was still watching the unconscious men with sharp, piercing eyes. "They won't stop," he muttered. "You know that, don't you?" The wolf didn't answer, of course. But she didn't need to. She knew. Samuel sighed and gestured toward the cabin. "Come on. We need to get ready." He started back through the snow, his muscles aching from the cold and exertion. The wolf followed, her paws silent against the frozen ground. When they reached the cabin, Samuel bolted the door behind them and stoked the fire. He stripped off his coat, his fingers numb as he set his rifle on the table. The male wolf lay where he had left him, breathing heavily but still alive. The female padded over and nuzzled his muzzle. He let out a weak whine in response. Samuel watched them for a long moment, then rubbed a hand down his face. He had spent years in this cabin, alone by choice. But now, he had blood on his hands. Strangers hunting wolves on his land, and a storm raging outside, hiding more danger in its depths. Samuel pulled a chair close to the fire and sat heavily. The female wolf curled up beside the injured male, her body curled protectively around his. Samuel exhaled sharply. He had a feeling neither of them would be getting much sleep tonight. The storm had calmed, but the air was thick with tension. The world outside was cloaked in white, the snow pristine except for the footprints leading to the tree line. Samuel stood at the window, his rifle in hand. His gut told him something was coming. He had been right before. The wolves stirred behind him. The female was alert again, her body tense. The male had managed to lift his head, but he was still weak. Samuel muttered under his breath and checked the ammunition in his rifle. Then, a sound. Not the wind. Not the creak of the cabin settling. A footstep. Samuel's grip tightened. He moved silently to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The wolves were still now, their breathing slow and measured. Another step. Then a voice. Low. Calculated. "You should have stayed out of this, Carter." Samuel's heart pounded. They weren't just here for the wolves anymore. They were here for him. He slowly backed away from the door, raising his rifle. Then, bang! A gunshot shattered the silence. The window beside him exploded in a spray of glass and wood. Samuel dropped to the ground, rolling for cover behind the table. The wolves let out sharp growls, the female standing protectively in front of the injured male. Voices shouted outside. Footsteps crunched against the snow. Samuel took a slow breath. This was it. No more warnings. No more second chances. He pressed his back against the wall, his finger tightening on the trigger. Then, movement. A shadow passed by the shattered window. Samuel didn't hesitate. He fired. The shadow jerked back with a strangled cry. Another voice screamed something incoherent, and then more gunfire erupted, splintering the wooden walls of the cabin. Samuel ducked, cursing under his breath. The female wolf was growling, her body low to the ground. The injured male whined, shifting weakly. Samuel's mind raced. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched. He crawled toward the back door, his breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. The wolves followed, instinct driving them toward survival. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Snow. Trees. No sign of movement. He gestured for the wolves to move. The female hesitated only for a moment before slipping outside, her body low, her injured companion struggling behind her. Samuel followed, rifle raised. He knew this land better than they did. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. He took one last glance at the cabin, his home, his sanctuary. Then, with a deep breath, he vanished into the trees. The cold bit into Samuel's skin as he moved through the trees, his rifle steady in his hands. His breath curled in the air like smoke, dissipating into the silence of the frozen forest. Behind him, the wolves followed, their bodies low to the ground, their golden eyes sharp with instinctive awareness. The injured male limped, his strength waning, but he refused to fall behind. Samuel glanced back once. The female wolf moved close to her companion, her presence urging him forward. Despite everything, despite the blood, the pain, the danger, they were still together. That mattered. A gunshot rang out. The sound shattered the quiet, reverberating through the pines. Samuel instinctively ducked, pulling the wolves down with him. Snow exploded near his feet as a bullet slammed into a nearby tree, sending bark flying. They were still coming. The men who had attacked his cabin weren't about to let him walk away. He had wounded at least one of them, but that wasn't enough. He needed to disappear, to vanish into the forest like a ghost. He gestured to the wolves and took off in a crouched run. The female didn't hesitate, but the male was slowing. Samuel cursed under his breath. If they were going to survive, he needed to make a decision, and fast. Another shot. Closer this time. Samuel veered sharply to the right, pushing through thick undergrowth. He knew this land better than they did. There was an old ravine nearby, hidden beneath layers of snow and ice. If he could reach it before they did, he could set a trap. The wolves followed his lead, their breath labored but steady. The snow grew deeper as they moved, slowing their progress. Samuel's pulse pounded in his ears. He could hear their pursuers now, voices, the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Then, the ravine. It opened up before him, a sheer drop concealed by a deceptively smooth layer of snow. Samuel stopped just short of the edge, his breath coming fast. He turned, eyes scanning the terrain. The female wolf stood beside him, her ears flicking back as she listened. The male collapsed onto the snow, his sides heaving. Samuel looked at them both, then at the approaching figures in the trees. There was no time to hesitate. He slung his rifle over his back and bent down, scooping the injured wolf into his arms. The male let out a weak growl but didn't resist. Samuel turned to the female, meeting her eyes. "Trust me." Then, without another word, he stepped backward and dropped into the ravine. The fall was brief but brutal. He twisted midair, holding the wolf tight against his chest as the wind rushed past them. Snow and ice broke beneath them as they landed hard. Samuel rolled to absorb the impact, pain lancing up his spine. The wolf in his arms whimpered but was still breathing. Above them, the female wolf hesitated on the edge. Then she leapt. She landed gracefully beside them, shaking off the snow. Samuel barely had time to catch his breath before he heard voices above them. Where the hell did they go? A pause. Then another voice, rougher. They couldn't have just disappeared. Samuel pressed himself against the ravine wall, willing himself to become part of the shadows. The wolves did the same, their instincts guiding them. Above, the men paced the edge, scanning the landscape. Then, one of them cursed. "Damn storms covering their tracks. We need to keep moving." Footsteps retreated. The voices faded into the wind. Samuel didn't move for a long time. The wolves remained still, their breath barely visible in the frigid air. Then, finally, Samuel exhaled. They had made it. For now. Hours passed before Samuel felt safe enough to move. The storm had calmed, but the forest remained eerily silent. He adjusted his grip on the injured wolf and started forward, keeping low. The ravine was their best chance at slipping away unnoticed. It stretched for miles, winding through the wilderness like a scar. If they followed it far enough, they could lose their pursuers completely. The female wolf stayed close, her eyes constantly scanning for danger. Samuel could see the exhaustion in her body, but she didn't falter. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their feet. Samuel's arms burned from the weight of the wolf, but he didn't stop. Not until they reached shelter. Eventually, they found a small cave nestled into the rock face. It was shallow but dry, offering them a brief reprieve from the cold. Samuel set the injured wolf down gently. The male let out a weak sigh, his body curling inward. The female immediately settled beside him, pressing her muzzle against his. Samuel rubbed his hands together, trying to summon some warmth. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small flask of water. He poured a little into his palm and offered it to the male wolf, who lapped it up weakly. Samuel exhaled. They had survived the night. But he knew better than to think this was over. Those men weren't just hunters. They weren't just after the wolves. They were after him now, too. Samuel leaned against the cave wall, staring out at the snow-covered wilderness. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war. The forest was silent, but Samuel knew better than to trust the quiet. He moved through the trees with practiced precision, his rifle steady in his grip. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, their deceptive serenity masking the bloodshed that had already begun. Behind him, the wolves followed, one strong, one wounded, but both determined. The female stayed close to Samuel's side, her golden eyes sharp and alert. The male, despite his injuries, limped forward with quiet resilience, refusing to be left behind. Samuel crouched behind a fallen log and scanned the area. The men who had shot at them were still out there. He had seen at least 3 silhouettes in the snowstorm, and now that the storm had calmed, they would be closing in. He had to end this before they found him. Before they found the wolves. A distant voice cut through the trees. "Spread out. He can't have gone far." Samuel exhaled slowly. He recognized that voice. And suddenly, the past came rushing back. It had been a night much like this one. The frost had bitten through his uniform, his breath had come in short bursts, and death had lurked in every shadow. He had been hunting men back then, too. Or maybe they had been hunting him. One of them, a young soldier with cruel eyes and a sharp tongue, had laughed when Samuel hesitated to pull the trigger. "You don't have the stomach for this," the man had sneered. Samuel had pulled the trigger anyway. The laughter had died with him. But the voice had stayed with him, and now it was here again. In his woods. Calling for his blood. Samuel gritted his teeth and forced the memories away. He wasn't that man anymore. But he would do what needed to be done. He gestured for the wolves to stay low as he moved toward the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. The female obeyed, pressing her belly to the frozen ground, her breath slow and steady. The male wolf lay beside her, his body tensed despite his wounds. Samuel climbed a low ridge and peered through the trees. 3 men. 2 were armed with rifles, scanning the area. The third, him, was standing with his back to Samuel, barking orders. "He's got the wolves with him. Shoot them if you have to, but bring him in alive." Samuel's grip tightened on his rifle. Alive. That meant they weren't just after the wolves anymore. They were after him. Samuel took slow, measured breaths. He had one advantage. They thought he was still running. They didn't know he was hunting them now. He raised his rifle, lined up the shot. Then, something moved in the trees. A shape, low and fast. The female wolf. Before Samuel could react, she sprang forward. A growl ripped through the air, followed by a sharp scream. One of the men barely had time to turn before she was on him, her teeth sinking deep into his arm. He cried out, stumbling backward, his rifle falling into the snow. The other 2 spun around, their guns raised. Samuel took his shot. The second man dropped before he could pull the trigger, his body collapsing into the snow with a dull thud. The leader, the man from his past, was already moving, grabbing his fallen comrade's rifle. Samuel was faster. He leaped from the ridge, his boots slamming into the snow just as the leader raised his gun. They collided hard, the rifle spinning out of reach. The fight was brutal. Fists, elbows, the sharp crack of bone against bone. Samuel grunted as a punch landed against his ribs, but he didn't let up. He drove his knee into the man's stomach, sending him staggering backward. The leader snarled, wiping blood from his mouth. "Still a killer, huh, Carter?" he spat. Samuel didn't answer. He lunged. The 2 men hit the ground hard, rolling through the snow, fists swinging. The leader clawed for his knife. Samuel caught his wrist, twisting hard. The knife fell, landing between them. The female wolf was circling, growling, waiting for an opening. The male wolf, wounded but watching, let out a weak but determined snarl. Samuel saw the leader's eyes flick toward the knife. He made his move first. With a swift motion, he grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him into the snow. The leader coughed, blood flecking his lips. He struggled, but Samuel was already pressing the barrel of his rifle against his chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The forest was silent again. Then, "Finish it," the leader sneered. Samuel's finger hovered over the trigger. The war inside him waged on. But he wasn't that man anymore. Not the one who killed because he was told to. Not the one who pulled the trigger because someone expected him to. Instead, he stood up, keeping the rifle trained on the leader. "You're going to leave," Samuel said, his voice steady. "You're going to tell whoever sent you that this land isn't theirs to take. And if you ever come back." The female wolf let out a low growl, stepping closer. Samuel didn't need to finish the sentence. The leader's face twisted in fury, but he knew he had lost. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, standing slowly, clutching his ribs. Samuel didn't answer. The leader spat blood into the snow, then turned and limped away. Samuel watched him go, the wolves at his side. He knew the fight wasn't over. But for now, they had one. The fire crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows along the cabin walls. Samuel sat on the floor, exhausted, his back against the couch. The female wolf was curled beside him, her head resting on his knee. The male wolf lay nearby, his breathing stronger now, his wounds healing. For the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel alone. He reached out, running his fingers through the female's thick fur. She let out a soft huff, nudging his hand with her nose. Samuel exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from his body. Tomorrow, there would be more problems. Tomorrow, he would have to decide what to do next. But tonight, he wasn't the man he used to be. Tonight, he was something more. Something new. A protector. A guardian. A part of the wild. The wolves had chosen him, and he had chosen them right back. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin's windows like a restless spirit. Samuel stood at the doorway, staring into the darkness beyond the tree line. The fire behind him crackled, casting his long shadow against the wooden walls. The wolves lay close, their golden eyes reflecting the flickering flames. The female's ears were pricked forward, alert. The male, though still recovering, watched Samuel closely, sensing the storm brewing in his mind. He hadn't slept, not since the fight. Not since the man from his past had walked away. The threat was still out there, lurking like a predator waiting for its moment to strike. Samuel exhaled slowly, gripping the rifle at his side. He had spent years running from the past. Now, it had followed him into the wilderness. And this time, he wouldn't run. Not anymore. A sudden rustling in the underbrush made Samuel's muscles tense. The female wolf let out a low growl, her body coiled and ready to spring. The male lifted his head, his nose twitching. Samuel raised his rifle. Then, a figure emerged from the trees. Not one of the men. A woman. She was wrapped in a thick fur coat, her face half hidden by a scarf. Snow clung to her shoulders, and her breath came in short, visible bursts. Samuel narrowed his eyes, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman raised her hands, stepping cautiously into the firelight. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "But you need to listen to me. Now." The female wolf bristled but didn't attack. Samuel didn't lower his rifle. "Start talking." The woman's eyes flicked to the wolves, lingering on the injured male. Something unreadable crossed her face before she met Samuel's gaze again. "They're coming back," she said. "And this time, they won't stop until they kill you all." Samuel's grip tightened on his rifle. He had expected this. But hearing it aloud made his stomach turn to ice. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice low. The woman hesitated, then pulled down her scarf. "My name is Elena," she said. "And I know what they're after." Samuel let Elena inside, though he never took his eyes off her. She stood near the fire, warming her hands. The wolves remained close, watching her as warily as Samuel did. After a moment, she spoke. "You think they came here for the wolves," she said, glancing at the female, then the male. "That's only part of it." Samuel folded his arms. "Go on." Elena sighed. "The men who attacked you, my brother was one of them." Samuel tensed. "The wolves did, too." Elena lifted her hands. "I didn't come here to defend him. He's a bastard. Always has been." She exhaled, shaking her head. "But I know what they're really after. It's not just the wolves." Samuel said nothing. "They're after the land." Samuel felt his stomach twist. "They work for people who want to turn this wilderness into something else," Elena continued. "Logging, hunting lodges, money." She turned to him. "And you're in the way." Samuel clenched his jaw. He had seen this before. Land stolen, nature erased, the wolves driven out, or worse. And he would die before he let that happen. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the cabin walls. Elena watched Samuel carefully. "They'll be here by morning," she said. "If you want to survive, you need to leave. Now." Samuel looked at the wolves. The female met his gaze, unblinking. The male, despite his wounds, lifted his head. Samuel knew what they were telling him. They weren't leaving, and neither was he. Elena saw the decision on his face and exhaled sharply. "Damn it, you don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Samuel interrupted. A long silence stretched between them. Then, "What if I help you?" Elena said suddenly. Samuel raised an eyebrow. She swallowed. "I know their movements. I know their plans. I can help you stop them." Samuel studied her. "Why?" Elena hesitated. Then she glanced at the wolves. "When I was a kid," she said, her voice softer now, "I got lost in the woods during a snowstorm." She exhaled, as if remembering something painful. "A wolf found me," she whispered. "A big one. Black as night." Samuel remained silent. Elena met his gaze. "He stayed with me until morning. Kept me warm. Kept me safe." Her fingers curled into fists. "And then, when I tried to tell my family, they shot him." Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. "They think wolves are nothing," she said bitterly. "Just animals to be hunted. Killed." Her eyes darkened. "I won't let that happen again." A long silence stretched between them. Then Samuel nodded once. Elena exhaled. We have until sunrise, she said. Then they come. Samuel glanced at the wolves. The female let out a low, rumbling growl. The male lifted his head higher. No one was running. Not this time. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the sky, Samuel was ready. The cabin was dark, the fire long extinguished. Snow blanketed the ground, erasing footprints, hiding them in plain sight. The wolves crouched low, waiting. Elena was beside Samuel, gripping a knife. Then, footsteps. Voices. They had come. Samuel steadied his breathing, his grip firm on his rifle. Elena tensed beside him. The female wolf let out a soft, warning growl. Then, a gunshot shattered the silence. Samuel moved first. The wolves followed. The battle had begun. The first gunshot shattered the stillness of dawn. Samuel ducked low, pressing himself against the wooden wall of the cabin. The wolves crouched beside him, their ears pricked forward, muscles coiled like springs. Elena gripped her knife, her breath visible in the cold air. Then, another shot. The bullet buried itself into the wood inches from Samuel's head. They're trying to force us out, he muttered. Elena swallowed. Then we don't give them that chance. Samuel nodded. Then, everything exploded into chaos. The female wolf moved first. Like a streak of silver lightning, she bolted from the cabin's cover and into the snow. A man barely had time to react before she lunged, her powerful jaws clamping down on his arm. He screamed, dropping his rifle. Samuel took the opportunity. He raised his gun and fired. The man collapsed. Another attacker rushed forward. The injured male wolf, despite his wounds, let out a deep, guttural snarl and lunged. He moved slower than usual, but his fury made up for it. He knocked the man to the ground, his teeth flashing. Blood sprayed across the snow. Elena gasped beside Samuel, gripping her knife tighter. Samuel didn't hesitate. He took aim and fired again. Another attacker fell. But there were more. Too many. Samuel knew they were outnumbered. 3 men remained, moving carefully through the trees. They had seen what the wolves could do. They weren't charging in blindly now. One of them lifted his rifle, aiming for the female wolf. Samuel's heart slammed against his ribs. He fired first. The man staggered, a strangled gasp escaping his lips before he crumpled into the snow. Another man fired back. The bullet grazed Samuel's shoulder. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain. Elena let out a sharp cry as she lunged at the last man, her knife flashing. She wasn't trained for this. But she was fast. She buried the blade into his side. The man gasped, staggering backward, right into the injured male wolf's waiting jaws. It was over in seconds. Then, silence. Only the sound of heavy breathing and the distant howling wind remained. Samuel lowered his rifle. The snow was stained red. The wolves stood panting, their fur streaked with blood, some theirs, some not. Samuel turned to Elena. She was shaking, her breath coming in sharp gasps, but she was alive. It's over, he said. She met his eyes. Not yet. Samuel followed her gaze. A figure stood at the edge of the tree-line. Not just any man. Elena's brother, the leader of the group. And he wasn't alone. He had a gun pressed against the head of a third wolf. A young one. A pup. Samuel's blood turned to ice. The female wolf let out a sharp, distressed whine. Her pup. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. Put the gun down, he said, his voice dangerously low. Elena's brother smirked. You think you've won? This doesn't end here. He pressed the barrel harder against the pup's skull. You walk away now, and maybe, just maybe, I let it live. Samuel's grip tightened on his rifle. He had seconds to decide. Then, the female wolf moved. Faster than anyone expected. She lunged. The man fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees. For a split second, everything stood still. Then the man crumpled, his throat torn open. The pup stumbled backward, unharmed. Samuel exhaled. It was finally over. The wolves gathered around the pup, nudging it gently. Samuel turned to Elena. She was staring at her brother's lifeless body, her expression unreadable. He placed a hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry. She swallowed hard, nodding. Then she whispered, let's go home. The bodies were buried beneath the snow. Samuel knew the forest would reclaim them soon enough. The cabin stood, battered but still strong. The wolves remained. The pup, now safe, stayed close to its mother. Samuel knew the battle had been won. But the war? That was another story. For now, though, they had peace. And as he stood beside the wolves, watching the first light of dawn break through the trees, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. They had fought for each other. And they had survived. Together. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. Samuel stood at the cabin's doorstep, watching as the golden light of morning painted the snow-covered land. The battle from the previous night felt like a distant nightmare, one that had left its mark on all of them. The wolves lay in the snow, resting. The mother curled protectively around her pup, her eyes half closed but still watchful. The injured male wolf lay nearby, his breathing steady but slow. He had fought despite his wounds, and Samuel knew he would need time to heal. Elena stood beside Samuel, her arms wrapped around herself as she took in the scene. "They're safe now," she murmured. Samuel nodded. "We all are." But even as he said it, he knew their journey wasn't over. The wolves, despite their wild nature, had placed their trust in him. That trust needed to be honored. Over the next few days, Samuel worked tirelessly to care for them. He stitched up the wounded wolf's gash with steady hands, using supplies from his emergency kit. He boiled water, preparing warm broth for Elena and himself, making sure they both regained their strength. The female wolf, though cautious, allowed Samuel to approach her pup. The little one had soft, silver-gray fur and bright, curious eyes. It sniffed Samuel's outstretched hand before giving a tentative lick. Elena chuckled. "I think you've won him over." Samuel smiled, a warmth spreading in his chest. Maybe. The wolves had become more than just animals passing through his life. They were family now. As the days turned into weeks, the wolves never left. Samuel expected them to return to the wild, but they lingered, circling the cabin, hunting in the nearby woods, and always returning by nightfall. It was the pup who bonded with him the most. It followed him when he chopped wood, nipping at his boots. It yipped excitedly when he prepared food, eager to see what he was doing. One morning, Samuel sat on the porch, watching the sunrise, when the pup trotted up and curled at his feet. Elena stepped outside and smiled. "Looks like he's chosen you." Samuel ran his fingers through the pup's soft fur. "Looks like I don't have a choice." Elena sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "You don't have to be alone, you know," she said softly. "Not anymore." Samuel met her gaze. For so long, he had lived in isolation, haunted by ghosts of his past. But now, sitting here with Elena and the wolves, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. Not unless he chose to be. Spring came earlier than expected. The snow melted, revealing rich, dark soil beneath. Samuel and Elena worked together, preparing the land for planting. They gathered seeds from a nearby town, bringing back supplies to repair the cabin. The wolves thrived. The injured male regained his strength, running alongside the mother and the pup as they hunted. They were a family, one that Samuel had become a part of. Elena chose to stay. She had lost everything, but she found something new in the wilderness, a purpose, a home, and perhaps even love. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she turned to Samuel. "You saved them," she said, watching the wolves play in the distance. Samuel shook his head. "They saved me." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The wilderness, once a place of solitude, had become a place of belonging. A place where man and beast coexisted, not as enemies, but as family. Together, they had survived. Together, they had found peace. And together, they would face whatever came next. In the heart of the wild, Samuel learned that strength is not just about fighting battles, it is about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. That family is not always determined by blood but by the bonds we choose to nurture. And that when we open our hearts, even to the most unexpected of creatures, we find a love that transcends fear, pain, and loss. No one survives alone. Not wolves. Not people. Not anyone. Samuel's story is a reminder that the natural world is not our enemy, it is our home. The wolves he once feared became his greatest allies, proving that even the wildest of hearts can be filled with loyalty, courage, and love. Protect the wild. Respect the creatures that share this earth with us. Open your heart. Sometimes, the ones we least expect can teach us the most. Find your pack. No one is meant to walk this world alone. As the last howl echoed through the mountains, Samuel knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. It was a new beginning.